Yasujiro Ozu's Late Spring is about a widowed father, Shokichi, who feels he has to marry off his daughter, Noriko, due to fears that when he dies she'll be alone. Like most of Ozu's work, a story overview can never properly convey the delicate complexity and emotional depth the film offers. Although my favourite film of his has changed throughout various periods of my life, I always end up coming back to this one. I'll properly dedicate some time explaining why this is my favourite from Ozu, but that's for a different video. Late Spring has been covered quite a lot on YouTube, but so far I haven't seen a video that focuses on the film from the context of US colonialism, which is really important as the film was released in 1949, right in the middle of Japan's Allied occupation. This was a period in Japanese history after World War II where the country was occupied by several nations, but effectively led by the USA. I'm going to argue that we can use Ozu's famous, gentle and nuanced approach to filmmaking to unveil potentially hidden clues at the US colonial presence in Japan and the influence it was having on local filmmakers. Before I get to the film, I need to spend some time talking about Japan and American colonialism in general. For around 7 years, Japan was subjected to an intense occupation by almost 1 million US troops. Japan had no sovereignty nor diplomatic relations and functioned within a virtual dictatorship by General MacArthur, who has been described as being the indisputable overlord of Japan. Japan in many ways was in a worse situation than most colonies, as it was pretty much in a prison because Japanese people weren't allowed to travel abroad until the very end of the occupation. In addition, no economic or political decisions could be made without the conqueror's approval, and no public criticism of the American regime was permissible either. The occupiers viewed their presence in Japan, particularly by General MacArthur, as a Christian mission for white men to take control over the pagan Oriental society. As well as this usual sense of racist superiority and cultural arrogance, the occupation of Japan is often seen as the last colonial exercise of the white man's burden, though this is contestable. Obviously, colonialism causes a wide range of problems when it comes to public law, education and government service, but when it comes to the influence colonialism has on the colonised people's culture, we tend to see this arise more in the intimate and practical relations of family and day-to-day life. This naturally brings us to Ozu, who mastered exactly this: domestic dramas that focus on the normative practical problems of human relations. Ozu almost never focused on larger, more public issues, and even when he did, his concerns were more with the impact they had on the private and intimate lives of individual people. There are the more obvious expressions Ozu used to suggest the US occupation, the focus on English road signs and adverts like Drink Coca-Cola or the Western Balboa Tea and Coffee Shop. These all remind us of the colonial context of the film, but are generally unrelated to the main concerns of the story. There are many of these rather inconsequential references to the environmental characteristics of US colonialism, but there are also, in typical Ozu fashion, implicit hints at the occupation's deeper rooted influences and presence. This includes, which may come as a shock to many Ozu fans, some of the sexual implications connected with the occupation and its censorship processes. An example of this is when Noriko's friend Aya is introduced. She's divorced and extremely bitter about her ex-husband. Aya mentions that his name is Ken, to which Noriko's father assumes is short for Kenkichi. But given the context, it's reasonable to assume that this terrible ex-husband is in fact an American soldier. Due to censorship practices of the time, depictions of relationships between occupation personnel and Japanese women were forbidden until the end of the occupation. Therefore, Ozu would have had to have been very subtle with these kind of references. Thus, having the father assume Ken means Kenkichi and it not being properly corrected would have been a clever move. Also, Aya gossips about a mutual friend who is unmarried and pregnant. She whispers this evidently horrible story to Noriko, but why whisper? There's clearly no one else in the room. One reason for this is that the information was intended to be kept away from the audience, or should I say, the occupation authority censors. It would make sense if the unwed pregnancy was from a relationship with a soldier, because so-called mixed-blood children fathered by American soldiers was also prohibited during the occupation. Many watching this video might feel that these interpretations are quite contrived or heavy-handed, but it's important to understand that the reason why I'm pushing my readings towards US soldiers is because these relationships were incredibly common at the time, and for a filmmaker like Ozu, who liked to depict the lives of ordinary people, such common affairs would have been unavoidable. During the occupation, there were 3 common types of these relationships. All could apply to Aya and Noriko's friend's situation. The first involved the prostitution of Japanese women for GIs. This took 2 forms. One was women seeking employment in an economically difficult time, and the other, more sinister form, was related to the government organised program where women were recruited to sacrifice their bodies for the good of the nation. This program was actually instituted by the Japanese authorities to limit rape, as according to one calculation, the number of rapes and assaults on Japanese women was around 40 per day whilst the program was in effect, and then rose to 330 after it was terminated in 1946, just after the Allied occupation began. Unfortunately, given this disturbing data, sexual abuse could also lead to the situation gossiped about by Aya. However, it was not uncommon for Japanese women to date American soldiers. This was partly due to the fact soldiers had financial advantages over Japanese men, meaning they generally had more money to spend on dating. This wasn't the only reason though. Many young Japanese men had died during the war, and women between 20 to 29 outnumbered men in the same age bracket by over 1 million, so Japanese women really had few options. Of course, Noriko and Aya's friend might have become pregnant by a Japanese person, but given the deliberate ambiguities and socio-political context, there's a good chance Ozu was gently hinting at an American soldier. Later on, Noriko visits her aunt, who has a potential marriage prospect for her. The aunt explains that this young man looks like the US actor Gary Cooper, to which he specifies his mouth is like Gary Cooper's, whereas the top half of his face is different. Here again are hints at the occupation. An important characteristic of colonialism is the hegemonic culture governs popular entertainment and defines aesthetic ideals. Both are related. It's a well-established phenomenon that people judge facial beauty by averaging across instances of faces. This would generally mean that Japanese people see many Japanese and form an aesthetic ideal that averages Japanese features, and Europeans see many Europeans and form an aesthetic ideal that averages European features. However, when Europeans dominate the production of culture, it presents Japanese with European faces frequently and intensively. We look at an actor's face on the big screen more fixedly and for longer periods of time than we look at the faces of ordinary people in daily life. This almost always affects aesthetic norms. Don't get me wrong, in other areas of context, cross-ethnic effects are not a bad thing. They can often expand our appreciation of facial beauty. The issues arise when this affects one group but not the other. Let's be honest, how many Americans in the 1940s would cite a male Japanese actor as an exemplar of masculine beauty? The aunt's qualification regarding the top half of the potential groom's face is important as well. Patrick Hogan argues that it alludes to the racist view of the Japanese as having distinctively narrow eyes. Hogan goes on to say, quote, "In some ways, Ozu almost seems continually aware of the occupation censors as part of his audience. Here it's as if he's politely bowing to his censors and saying indirectly, of course no handsome American actor would have slanty Japanese eyes." End quote. The occupation censors originally flagged Gary Cooper being named because he was an American actor. Yet scholar Kyoko Hirano believes it was overturned after the censors realised he was mentioned in a flattering way and self-deprecating manner regarding the Japanese. The dignity of US culture and aesthetics were not being challenged. Although Hogan claims that this shouldn't be taken too seriously, he also associates it with sly civility, which is essentially a type of extreme politeness that blurs the lines between self-deprecation and criticism of the addressee. In this case, the self-deprecation could be seen as joking that Japanese features are aesthetically inferior to American stars like Gary Cooper, and criticism of the addressee being some members of the occupation censors who harboured condescending attitudes towards comparing European standards of masculine beauty to Japanese men, a common attitude of the time. Ozu also expresses a degree of resistance to the American antagonism against arranged marriages. Censors were so opposed to arranged marriages, they flagged parts of Ozu's script. They felt it was an attempt to preserve feudalistic values. However, it's important to make it clear that Ozu isn't trying to pander to cultural traditionalism, nor is he trying to affirm the value of arranged marriages simply as the way the Japanese do things. He's suggesting that arranged marriages can sometimes be valuable given their individual circumstances. It's pragmaticism primarily, especially regarding attachment bonding and security, and not by its relation to traditional purity. Despite Ozu being known in the West as the most Japanese of Japanese filmmakers, it's easy to assume he wanted to push for traditionalism over the developing Americanization, but as we see from the film's opening scene, traditions are appreciated but not prioritized. The film beautifully depicts a tea ceremony when Noriko is with her aunt. However, the scene focuses more of its attention on the two characters humorously talking about ways to make use of worn-out clothing. Although Ozu respects tradition, he's more concerned with practical relationships and interactions. For me, Ozu's resistance to US colonialism in Late Spring was not to preserve the Japanese way of life in the face of American imperialists. The film is far too liberal for that. As Hogan argues, it was to express a morality that values empathy and attachment within human relations, something US imperialism was, if unintentionally, compromising as a means of protecting its vision of Japan's so-called modernization. Anyway, thanks for watching, and hopefully I've provided a slightly different perspective on what is, well, for me anyway, Ozu's best film.